A 6-year-old girl stands at the altar of St. Paul's Cathedral, her tiny hands trembling beneath the weight of a crown too heavy for her head. Golden candlelight flickers across her pale face as a 29-year-old man waits to claim her as his bride. The Gothic arches tower above like silent witnesses to this grotesque ceremony, while hundreds of nobles watch a child being sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. This isn't a fairy tale, it's one of history's most heartbreaking political transactions, where a child's entire life was bartered away for the promise of peace between warring nations. Before we dive deeper into this shocking medieval story, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales from history that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the past. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices back to life, ensuring that the stories of history's most vulnerable victims are never forgotten. The year was 1396, and young Isabelle of France was about to become Europe's most tragic queen. But her story begins years earlier, in a palace where madness ruled supreme and innocence was nothing more than currency in the brutal game of medieval politics. The Louvre Palace, magnificent as it was, had become a theater of horror where a little girl would witness scenes that would scar her for life. Born into chaos on November 9th, 1389, at the magnificent Louvre Palace, Isabelle entered a world already shadowed by her father's terrifying mental illness. Charles VI of France, known throughout the kingdom as Charles the Mad, suffered from episodes so severe that servants would flee in terror when they began. Picture this, the most powerful man in France, suddenly convinced that invisible assassins lurked behind every tapestry, racing through marble corridors in nothing but his night clothes, screaming warnings about enemies that existed only in his fractured mind. During his most disturbing episodes, Charles believed his own body was made of fragile glass, refusing all human touch for fear he might shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. He would stand motionless for hours, afraid that the slightest movement might cause him to explode. Palace servants learned to approach him like he was a dangerous wild animal, never knowing if they would encounter the king or the madman on any given day. For little Isabelle, witnessing her father's transformation from loving parent to terrified stranger created wounds that would never fully heal. While her father battled demons only he could see, Isabelle's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, played an entirely different but equally destructive game. Cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless, she treated her own children like valuable commodities to be appraised, polished, and sold to the highest bidder in the European political marketplace. This woman, who should have been Isabelle's protector, instead became her greatest threat. Palace whispers spoke of Isabeau's numerous lovers and her complete indifference to maternal bonds. Courtiers watched in horror as she discussed her daughter's futures with the same casual enthusiasm others might reserve for planning a hunting expedition. For Isabeau, daughters existed solely to forge profitable alliances, their happiness or well-being mere inconveniences to be ignored in pursuit of political advantage. She would examine Isabelle with the cold calculation of a horse trader, evaluating her potential value in the marriage market while the child played innocently with her dolls nearby. Growing up in this poisonous atmosphere, little Isabelle witnessed scenes that would haunt any child for a lifetime. Picture a sensitive girl watching her father's episodes of madness while her mother plotted marriages with the same enthusiasm others might plan a feast. The palace that should have been her sanctuary became a prison of psychological terror, where love was conditional and children were valued only for their potential utility. France itself mirrored this domestic chaos with terrifying precision. The 100 Years' War raged against England like an infected wound that refused to heal. Noble factions tore the kingdom apart in their hunger for power, and the very foundations of royal authority crumbled beneath the weight of insanity. Peasants starved while nobles played their deadly games, and in the midst of this national nightmare, a little girl learned that her worth was measured solely by her ability to seal diplomatic deals she couldn't even understand. Then came 1396. the year that would seal Isabelle's fate forever with the finality of a death sentence. Across the treacherous waters of the English Channel, Richard II desperately needed peace, not for noble reasons, but for pure survival. His beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died, leaving him emotionally shattered and politically vulnerable. His treasury lay empty, drained by years of warfare and royal extravagance, while rebellions threatened his crown from multiple directions. When French diplomats, led by the calculating Duke of Berry, offered him Isabelle's hand in marriage, along with an astronomical dowry of £800,000 and a 28-year truce, it seemed like divine intervention. For France, bankrupted by endless warfare and torn apart by internal strife, this was a golden opportunity to buy peace with the sacrifice of one small girl. The mathematics were brutally simple. One child's life in exchange for decades of prosperity and stability. The negotiations were conducted with chilling practicality that would make modern human traffickers blush. French and English ambassadors haggled over the child as if she were prized livestock at market, debating her qualities and potential defects with the detached professionalism of experienced merchants. They discussed her bloodline, her health, her fertility prospects, and even her physical appearance, all while she played with her toys in another wing of the palace, blissfully unaware that her entire future was being auctioned to the highest bidder. Her extreme youth, shocking even by medieval standards where child marriages were common, sparked heated debates that lasted for months. Some English advisors suggested waiting until she reached 12, the traditional age for consummating royal marriages and bearing heirs. Others argued that her tender age was actually an advantage, allowing them to mold her into the perfect English queen without the interference of French influences. But Richard's desperation overruled all concerns about propriety, morality, or the bride's well-being. Political necessity had a way of silencing even the faintest whispers of conscience. What followed was a farewell that perfectly captured the tragedy unfolding in all its heartbreaking detail. At the Louvre, Charles VI, during one of his increasingly rare moments of clarity, blessed his daughter with tears streaming down his weathered face. For a brief moment, the mad king became a loving father again, understanding with crystal clarity what was being stolen from him. His wife Isabeau, however, displayed her characteristic coldness, treating the separation like a successful business deal that had finally reached completion after months of tedious negotiations. The child herself understood nothing beyond the excitement of what seemed like a grand adventure. Perhaps temporary, she hoped, like the hunting trips she'd taken with her father during his better days. She carefully packed her most treasured possessions, her beloved dolls with their silk dresses, a small dog that had been her constant companion through the palace's lonely corridors, and a few precious books that her French tutors had taught her to read. In her innocent mind, she would surely be home by Christmas, bringing wonderful stories of her English adventure to share with her family. The journey to London became a weeks-long spectacle of hollow grandeur that masked the horror of what was actually happening. English cities competed frantically to offer the most lavish receptions for their future queen, each trying to outdo the others with increasingly elaborate pageantry. Mayors commissioned special tapestries, musicians composed celebratory songs, and craftsmen worked day and night to create decorations worthy of royal notice. But behind all this pageantry, a terrified little girl frequently broke down in uncontrollable tears, begging her French attendants to take her home to her familiar rooms at the Louvre. Each mile carried her further from everything she had ever known, deeper into a fate she couldn't possibly comprehend. Her French retinue, consisting of hundreds of nobles, servants, and guards, tried their best to comfort her, but they too understood the grim reality of what was happening. They were escorting a child to her sacrifice, dressed up in silks and called by noble titles to make the transaction seem more palatable. St. Paul's Cathedral had been transformed into a stage for the most elaborate political theatre medieval Europe had ever French and English banners hung intertwined like serpents embracing their prey, Thousands of imported candles blazed against Gothic stonework, creating an almost supernatural atmosphere, and choirs sang in multiple languages to demonstrate the international significance of this union. The very stones seemed to pulse with the weight of history being made. Though few present understood, they were witnessing not a celebration but a funeral, the death of a child's innocence. The ceremony itself was designed to dazzle subjects and foreign observers alike, serving as living proof that England had achieved peace through diplomatic mastery rather than bloody military conquest. Every detail had been choreographed to perfection: the placement of nobles, the timing of musical interludes, even the specific words chosen for the various speeches. This was statecraft at its most refined, using spectacle to transform a morally questionable transaction into something that appeared noble and divinely blessed. Richard II, to his eternal credit, appeared genuinely uncomfortable with the proceedings unfolding before him. At 29, this cultured lover of literature and arts had cherished his first marriage to Anne of Bohemia with a passion that court poets had celebrated in verse. The prospect of wedding a frightened child, one young enough to be his daughter, clearly disturbed him on a deeply personal level, yet political necessity demanded he play his assigned role in this diplomatic charade. Throughout the ceremony, Isabelle remained eerily silent, her small frame dwarfed by the magnificent Gothic architecture surrounding her. The weight of her ceremonial robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, seemed to press her further into the cold marble floor. When the Archbishop of Canterbury knelt to place the wedding ring on her tiny finger, a ring that had to be specially sized down to fit a child's hand, she searched desperately for familiar faces among the sea of strangers, looking for her French attendants, who had been her only comfort during this nightmare journey. The moment she was declared Queen of England, witnessed by hundreds of nobles and foreign dignitaries, Isabelle showed no joy, no pride, no excitement. Instead, her face displayed only confusion and growing fear as the magnitude of her situation slowly began to dawn on her young mind. She was no longer Isabelle of France. She had become England's property, a living symbol of peace, purchased with childhood innocence. Her brief reign as England's child queen was marked by unexpected kindness that provided the only bright moments in an otherwise tragic tale. Richard, despite the political circumstances that had forced this union, treated Isabelle more like a cherished daughter than a wife he was expected to eventually consummate marriage with. Understanding the profound trauma she had endured, he provided her with French tutors who could speak her native language, allowed her to maintain her homeland's customs and religious practices, and ensured she lived in genuine dignity at Westminster Palace. Isabelle received her own lavishly appointed apartments, complete with French furnishings and tapestries that reminded her of home. She had a generous household budget, servants devoted exclusively to her well-being, and even her own private chapel where she could pray in French. For a few precious years, surrounded by carefully chosen attendants who genuinely cared for her welfare, it seemed the little queen might find some measure of happiness, despite the horrific circumstances that had brought her to England. She learned English, developed friendships with some of her ladies-in-waiting, and even began to show signs of the intelligent, spirited woman she might have become under different circumstances. But medieval politics showed no mercy for innocent children, regardless of how well protected they seemed. In September 1399, everything Isabelle had slowly begun to build collapsed in a single, devastating blow. Henry Bolingbroke's rebellion swept across England like wildfire, and Richard II, the man who had become something approaching a father figure to her, was swept from power in a coup that changed everything overnight. The deposed king died under mysterious circumstances at Pontefract Castle, with whispers of murder following his death for decades afterward. At just 10 years old, Isabelle had become a widow without ever truly being a wife, a queen without a kingdom, a child caught in the deadly machinery of political ambition that cared nothing for her well-being. The news of Richard's death hit her like a physical blow, destroying the fragile sense of security she had managed to build during her years in England. The new king, Henry IV, found himself facing an impossible dilemma that would have tested the conscience of any ruler. Isabel remained a legitimate queen by all legal standards, but her marriage had never been consummated. She had produced no heirs to complicate succession, and worst of all, her enormous dowry had already been spent on Richard's wars and court expenses. Returning her to France would mean repaying money that simply no longer existed in England's depleted treasury. The solution was as pragmatic as it was cruel. She became a golden prisoner, valuable enough to keep alive, but too dangerous to set free. Henry hoped to use her as a bargaining chip in future negotiations with France, a human pawn who might prove useful when diplomatic opportunities arose. So began 3 of the most agonizing years of Isabel's short life, confined to comfortable but inescapable captivity at Havering Castle, while her fate was debated by men who saw her only as a political asset to be managed. For 3 agonizing years, Isabel fought for her freedom from her gilded cage at Havering Castle with a determination that would have impressed seasoned diplomats. Her desperate letters to French relatives reveal a girl who had matured far beyond her years through suffering, forced to become her own advocate in a world where children were expected to remain silent and obedient. These letters, preserved in French archives, provide heartbreaking glimpses into the mind of a child grappling with abandonment and betrayal. One particularly heartbreaking message to her father declared, "I write to you in tears, for I am kept here like a prisoner far from all I love without hope of return. Each day I pray that God will soften the hearts of my captors and allow me to see my homeland once more before I die." Her words carried the weight of someone who had learned too young that promises could be broken, that love could be conditional, and that even queens could be discarded when they were no longer politically useful. Finally, in 1401, after lengthy diplomatic negotiations that treated her like a contested piece of territory, Isabel secured her release and freedom to return home. But the 6-year-old child who had left Paris in golden silks returned as a 12-year-old woman, prematurely aged by traumatic experiences that had stolen her childhood and replaced it with hard-earned wisdom about the cruelty of political power. The journey back to France should have been a triumphant homecoming, but instead it felt like another form of exile. Even her return to the Louvre brought no joy or healing. Her family received her more as an inconvenience than a beloved daughter finally restored to them. The political value of her English marriage had been completely lost with Richard's death, making her something of a liability in the complex calculations of French diplomacy. She was damaged goods in a world where a woman's worth was measured entirely by her ability to produce advantageous marriages and legitimate heirs. Tragedy, however, wasn't finished with Isabel. It had become her lifelong companion, following her with relentless persistence. In 1405, at 16, she was once again deployed as political currency when her mother Isabeau arranged a second marriage to Charles of Orléans, a young French poet and nobleman whose sensitivity and intelligence made him seem like a gift from a more merciful universe. This time, against all odds and expectations, fate offered an unexpected gift that seemed almost miraculous after years of suffering. Genuine love blossomed between them like flowers pushing through winter snow. Charles was sensitive, intellectual, and truly devoted to Isabel, not for her political connections or her potential to bear heirs, but for herself as a person. For the first time in her entire life, she experienced being valued for her mind, her spirit, her capacity for affection, rather than her usefulness as a political tool. Their love affair became the stuff of courtly legend, with Charles composing beautiful poetry celebrating Isabel's wit and beauty, while she discovered talents for music and literature that had been suppressed during her traumatic childhood. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that happiness might finally triumph over the political forces that had shaped her existence so cruelly. Their happiness proved heartbreakingly brief. lasting barely 2 years before the machinery of war destroyed it completely. In 1407, Charles was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt and sentenced to spend 25 years as a prisoner in the Tower of London, a quarter century that would consume the prime of his life and leave Isabelle effectively widowed once again. The irony was devastating. The same English who had once held her captive now imprisoned the only man who had ever truly loved her. Isabelle, now a widow in all but name, returned to the familiar patterns of solitude and dependence on the royal family that had already sacrificed her twice on the altar of political necessity. But this time her grief was different, deeper, more mature, tinged with the knowledge of what she had lost. She had experienced genuine love and partnership, making her current isolation all the more painful by comparison. During these final years of her short life, Isabelle lived quietly at the French court, dedicating herself to charity work and the arts, with a maturity that impressed even the most cynical courtiers. Her unique experiences as England's child queen had given her invaluable insights into politics and diplomacy, knowledge she used discreetly to advise other members of the royal family, helping them navigate the treacherous waters of international relations with wisdom earned through suffering. In 1409, she gave birth to her only child, Joan of Orleans, a daughter who would grow up never knowing her imprisoned father, but carrying his poetic gifts in her blood. Motherhood brought Isabelle some measure of consolation, but it was tinged with terrible irony that cut deeper than any physical pain. She understood with crystal clarity that her own daughter would likely face the same destiny that had destroyed her childhood, being bartered away in arranged marriages for political advantage, treated as valuable property rather than a human being deserving of love and protection. The cycle of sacrifice would continue, grinding up another generation of innocent girls on the altar of royal ambition, and there was nothing Isabelle could do to prevent it, despite all her hard-won wisdom and political knowledge. Isabelle of France died in 1409 at just 20 years old from postpartum complications. Her death passed almost unnoticed by chroniclers of the time, a stark contrast to the spectacular ceremonies that had marked her childhood wedding. She had fulfilled her role as a political instrument, producing an heir and sealing alliances, but never had the chance to live for herself. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how entire societies can normalize sacrificing children for political gain. More than 6 centuries later, Isabelle's tragedy still resonates as a chilling reminder of the human cost of treating young lives as bargaining chips. The girl who became queen at 6 paid the ultimate price for temporary peace between France and England. Her happiness, her childhood, and ultimately her life. The child princess delivered as a diplomatic gift never truly experienced childhood. From age 6, she carried responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, becoming a continuous sacrifice to medieval politics' merciless gods. Her memory stands as an eternal symbol of childhood's vulnerability before unchecked political power, reminding us that behind every historical treaty and royal alliance, there often existed children whose lives were destroyed to satisfy the powerful's ambitions. Isabelle of France remains history's witness to the price of peace, a price always paid by the innocent and powerless, never by those who made the deals. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more incredible historical tales that reveal the human stories behind the headlines we think we know. These forgotten voices deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing them back to life.